The restaurant was a symphony of muted clinks and hushed murmurs, a place so tastefully expensive it felt like a museum exhibit on wealth. James sat at the head of the long, linen-draped table, a reluctant king on a borrowed throne. He was 70 years old today. The thought felt foreign, like a coat that didn't quite fit. Around him, the air shimmered with the forced brightness of a celebration that was not for him, but about him. It was a performance, and he was its centerpiece. His son, David, had organized everything. David, with his perfectly tailored suit, his watch that cost more than James's first car, and his smile that never quite reached his eyes. He moved through the room with the practiced ease of a man who believed he was a master of every space he entered. He was a senior vice president at Innovate Corp., a title he mentioned with casual frequency, and he had the sleek, predatory confidence of a wolf who had long forgotten the scent of the wild. His wife, Claire, was the perfect counterpart. She was elegant and poised, her laughter a delicate, tinkling sound that seemed designed to fill any awkward silence. She drifted from guest to guest, a champagne flute permanently attached to her manicured hand, ensuring everyone was comfortable, everyone was impressed. She would occasionally glance over at James and offer him a radiant, sympathetic smile, the kind one gives to a beloved, slightly senile pet. James felt less like the guest of honor, and more like a piece of antique furniture they had decided to display. The guests, mostly David and Claire's friends and colleagues, would approach him in turns. They'd shake his hand, their grips either too firm or too limp, and offer platitudes. 70 years young, eh, James? A man with a booming voice and a pink tie said, clapping him on the shoulder. You don't look a day over 60. They spoke to him as if he were deaf or simple, their voices loud and slow. They asked no real questions about his life, his thoughts, his feelings. They were here for David. James was just the occasion. He watched his son work the room. David was magnificent in his element, a conductor orchestrating a symphony of networking and social climbing. He laughed at the right jokes, made the right introductions, his ambition a palpable energy field around him. James remembered a different David, a small boy with scraped knees and a fierce love for building things out of scrap wood in the garage. A boy who would look at him with wide, curious eyes and ask, "How does it work, Dad?" Where had that boy gone? When had he been replaced by this polished, hollow stranger? Finally, after the main course had been cleared and the dessert plates were being set, David tapped a knife against his glass, calling for silence. The room quieted, a sea of expectant faces turning towards him. "Friends, colleagues," David began, his voice smooth and resonant. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate a truly special man. My father, James." He paused, placing a hand over his heart in a gesture of practiced sincerity. For 70 years, this man has been a rock, a quiet, steady presence in my life. He worked tirelessly to provide for our family, to give me the opportunities he never had. James felt a familiar dull ache in his chest. It was the speech David gave every year, slightly modified for the occasion. It was a beautiful speech, filled with all the right words. But it was a performance, a story David told himself and others, a narrative that cast him as the grateful son of a simple, hard-working man. It conveniently omitted the fact that the opportunities he had were built on the foundation of the very company James had created and then walked away from. And now, David continued, his voice taking on a graver, more caring tone. As he enters this new chapter of his life, it is my turn, our turn, to take care of him, to ensure his golden years are truly golden, free from worry, free from burdens. He turned to James, his eyes shining with what, to the rest of the room, looked like pure filial devotion. "Dad, we wanted to give you something more than just another tie or a bottle of scotch. We wanted to give you the gift of peace of mind." He gestured to Claire, who approached with a large, beautifully wrapped gift box. She placed it on the table in front of James. The room was silent, everyone leaning in with anticipation. James looked at the box, then at his son's smiling face. A cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. Slowly, he untied the silk ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of tissue paper, was not a watch or a photo album. It was a thick, glossy brochure bound in dark green leather. The cover read, "An elegant gold script, Silver Willows, a premier community for discerning seniors." He lifted the brochure. Underneath it was a heavy, embossed certificate. It was a reservation confirmation, a deposit paid in full for a one-bedroom suite at the most exclusive and most expensive retirement facility in the state. The room erupted in applause. "Oh, David, how thoughtful," someone exclaimed. "What a wonderful son," another guest murmured. They all saw it as the ultimate act of love and provision, a son ensuring his aging father's every need would be met in luxury. James stared at the brochure. He saw pictures of smiling, silver-haired seniors playing shuffleboard. He saw a pristine dining hall with a menu that featured heart-healthy options. He saw a calendar of engaging daily activities, including watercolor painting and gentle yoga. It was a beautiful, gilded cage. He looked up at David, who was beaming, soaking in the admiration of the room. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the performance fell away. James saw the truth in his son's gaze, not love, but relief. The relief of a man who has finally solved a lingering, inconvenient problem. "Dad," David said, his voice loud enough for the whole table to hear, his smile unwavering. "It's time for you to rest, time to be taken care of. You've earned it. We've taken care of everything. It's time for you to be put away." That's what James heard. He felt the blood drain from his face. The sounds of the restaurant, the applause, the murmurs of admiration, all faded into a distant, roaring hum. The world narrowed to his son's smiling face and the 5 words that sealed his fate. "It's time for you to rest." He felt 100 different emotions warring inside him. Shock, grief, a profound, soul-crushing disappointment. But on the surface, he remained perfectly still. He slowly closed the brochure and looked at his son. He summoned the last reserves of his composure and forced a small, tight smile. "Thank you, David," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "It's a very generous gift." David's smile widened. He had won. He had successfully packaged his father's obsolescence as an act of love, and everyone had applauded. But as James sat there, amidst the clinking glasses and celebratory chatter, something new began to form in the wreckage of his heart. It was not despair. It was a cold, hard, and diamond-bright resolve. They thought he was a relic, a problem to be managed, a chapter to be closed. They had no idea that he was the one who had written the book. The ride home was a silent one. David and Claire, chattering in the front seat about how well the party had gone, how impressed everyone was, didn't seem to notice the profound stillness of the man in the back. James stared out the window at the blur of city lights, the glossy brochure for Silver Willows resting on his lap like a death sentence. It felt heavy, impossibly heavy, weighted with the crushing realization of his own irrelevance in the eyes of his son. When they dropped him off at his modest, quiet apartment, David walked him to the door. "Get some rest, Dad," he said, patting him on the back. "We'll talk about the move-in dates next week. No rush." It was the casual, dismissive kindness of a man closing a business deal. Inside, James didn't turn on the lights. He walked through the dark rooms and sat in his favorite armchair, the brochure still in his hand. He didn't open it. He didn't need to see the pictures of smiling, placid seniors again. He knew what it was, a beautifully furnished waiting room for the end of his life. And, in the oppressive silence of the apartment, the ghost of the man he used to be began to stir. He wasn't always this quiet, this unassuming. He wasn't born to be a steady presence or a rock. He was born to be a storm. The memories came flooding back, not as gentle waves of nostalgia, but as a fierce, powerful tide, washing away the meek, elderly man his son saw and revealing the giant who lay dormant beneath. It had all started in a garage. Not in Silicon Valley, but in a cramped, oil-stained garage behind a rented bungalow in a forgotten suburb. It was there, amidst soldering irons, scavenged circuit boards, and the smell of hot metal, that Innovate Corp was born. James, then in his late 20s, was a man possessed by an idea. A new kind of microprocessing architecture that was faster, more efficient, and decades ahead of its time. He worked with a feverish intensity, fueled by black coffee and an unshakable belief in his own vision. His wife, Margaret, was the quiet, unwavering heart of the operation. She was a high school science teacher with a mind as sharp as his own and a faith in him that was absolute. She would bring him sandwiches at 2 a.m., her hand resting on his shoulder as he hunched over a schematic. She learned to read his code, to debug his prototypes. She was not just his wife, she was his co-conspirator, his partner in a mad, brilliant dream. "You're not crazy, Jamie," she would whisper when his frustration mounted. "You're just early." David was a toddler then, playing on a blanket on the garage floor, surrounded by wires and resistors. He grew up with the hum of machinery as his lullaby. The company grew too. It moved from the garage to a small rented office, then to a larger one. They hired their first engineers, young, bright minds who were drawn to James's passion and genius. Innovate Corp became a cult, a place where innovation was a religion and James was its high priest. He was demanding, obsessive, and often difficult. But he inspired a fierce loyalty because he was always the smartest man in the room, and he was always right about the future. Then, 15 years ago, the storm inside him had quieted. Margaret was diagnosed with a fast-moving, merciless cancer. The 6 months that followed were a blur of hospitals, hushed conversations with doctors, and a slow, agonizing farewell. The light of his life was dimming, and with it, his own fire. He tried to keep working, but the passion was gone. The elegant beauty of a perfectly designed circuit board seemed trivial compared to the brutal, inefficient design of a human body that could betray itself so completely. After she died, the company felt like a hollow shell. It was a world built for two, and now there was only one. A month after the funeral, he called a meeting with the board of directors and his most trusted protege, a sharp young executive named Marcus Thorne. He announced he was stepping down. "But why, James?" Thorne had asked, his face a mask of confusion. "We're on the verge of a major breakthrough." "The breakthrough already happened," James had replied, his voice hollow. "The rest is just business." He didn't want a golden parachute or a public farewell tour. He wanted anonymity. He worked with his old friend and lawyer, Frank Peterson, to create a complex web of trusts and holding companies. On paper, his controlling interest, 51% of the company he had bled for, was transferred to an anonymous investment entity based in Delaware. He became a ghost in his own machine. He told the board he was selling his stake to a private equity firm. He told David he was retiring and live a quiet life on his savings. He did it for two reasons. First, the grief was a physical weight, and he no longer had the strength to carry both it and a multi-million-dollar corporation. Second, he wanted to give David a chance. His son, then a junior manager at the company, was ambitious and smart, but he was suffocating in his father's shadow. James believed that by disappearing, he was giving David the space to become his own man, to succeed or fail on his own terms. He never imagined that David would see his retreat not as a gift of freedom, but as an act of failure. Over the years, David climbed the corporate ladder at Innovate Corp. He was good at his job, charming, ruthless, and excellent at corporate politics. But he never understood the soul of the company. He saw it as a machine for generating profit, not a crucible for creating the future. He would visit James in his small, unassuming apartment and talk about quarterly earnings and market share, his eyes gleaming with a hunger James recognized but no longer shared. He would look around at his father's simple life, the worn armchair, the shelves of old books, the quiet routine, and James could see the pity in his eyes. It was the pity of a son who believes he has surpassed his father. David saw a man who had cashed out too early, who had lost his nerve. He never once asked about the early days. He never asked about the passion, the struggle, the genius that had made his own comfortable life possible. He saw a quiet old man, and he assumed that was all there was. Now, sitting in the dark, the glossy brochure for Silver Willows in his hand, James finally understood the depth of his miscalculation. He had stepped away to give his son freedom, and his son had used that freedom to become a man who would gladly lock his father in a cage, however gilded. He had wanted David to build his own legacy, and instead, his son had decided to bury his. A cold, hard anger began to burn through the fog of his grief. It was the anger of a king who had been mistaken for a peasant. He had been silent for 15 years. It was time, he realized, for the ghost to return. The 15 years following his retirement had not been idle ones. While David saw a father who had retreated into a world of quiet obsolescence, James was living a secret, parallel life. His small, unassuming apartment was not a place of surrender. It was an observation post. He was the silent shareholder, the ghost in the machine, and he had never stopped watching the company he had built. His days were structured with a quiet discipline. After his morning walk and a simple breakfast, he would sit at his old oak desk, not to pay bills or write letters, but to work. His computer was a high-end model, far more powerful than anything his son would have imagined him owning. On it, he accessed a secure, encrypted portal, a private window into the heart of Innovate Corp. His old friend, Frank Peterson, was the architect of this secret access. Frank was a shrewd, fiercely loyal lawyer of the old school, a man who understood that true power was often invisible. He managed the trust that held James's 51% stake, a labyrinth of legal entities that made the ownership untraceable to all but a select few. It was Frank who ensured that every quarterly report, every internal memo, every board meeting summary was uploaded to the secure portal for James to review. James read everything. He analyzed profit and loss statements with the same sharp eye that had once spotted flaws in a line of code. He studied market trends, competitor strategies, and internal R&D reports. He knew more about the day-to-day operations of Innovate Corp than most of its senior executives. He was a phantom, haunting the company's balance sheets and strategic plans. For years, he had been a passive observer. He watched as the company, under the leadership of his hand-picked successor, Marcus Thorne, continued to grow. The growth was steady, predictable, but something essential was missing. The wild, innovative spark that had defined the company's early years was being systematically extinguished. Lately, the signs of decay had become more alarming. Thorne, once a brilliant and daring executive, had grown complacent, more interested in appeasing Wall Street analysts than in funding the next big breakthrough. The company that had once been famous for its 10-year projects, the high-risk, high-reward ventures that James had championed, was now focused exclusively on quarterly returns. They were no longer building the future. They were milking the present, and David was at the heart of it. As Senior Vice President of Operations, he was Thorne's enforcer, the man responsible for implementing the new soul-crushing efficiency. James would read memos written by his son, filled with corporate jargon about optimizing synergy and leveraging core competencies, and feel a profound sense of disappointment. David was dismantling his father's legacy, one cost-saving measure at a time. He had championed the closure of the company's legendary Blue Sky Research Lab, the very place where James had developed his most revolutionary ideas, calling it an unjustifiable drain on resources. The gift of the Silver Willows brochure was not just an insult, it was a catalyst. It was the final, clarifying piece of evidence that his silence had been a catastrophic mistake. He had stepped back to allow his son to grow, but instead, David had shrunk, his ambition curdling into a petty, soulless greed. He had allowed his company, his life's work, to be steered toward a cliff of mediocrity by men who saw it as nothing more than a vehicle for their own enrichment. That night, after the hollow charade of his birthday party, James sat at his desk until the early hours of the morning. He didn't look at old photos. He looked at the latest Innovate Corp financials. He saw the declining R&D budget, the rise in executive bonuses, the alarming rate of departure among senior engineers. He saw a ship taking on water, while the captain and his first mate were busy polishing the brass. At 3 a.m., he picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. Frank Peterson answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep but instantly alert. "James, is everything all right?" "No, Frank," James said, his voice devoid of its usual quiet warmth. It was cold, clear, and sharp as a shard of ice. "Nothing is all right. It's time." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Frank's voice, now wide awake. "Time for what?" "Time for the ghost to come back to the boardroom." A slow smile spread across Frank's face, audible even over the phone. "I've been waiting for this call for 10 years, my friend. What's the plan?" "The plan is not simply to fire my son," James said. That would be too easy. It would teach him nothing. The plan is to dismantle the world he has built, piece by piece, in front of his own eyes. I want him to see the consequences of his choices, not just be told about them. For the next hour, they worked, their minds in perfect sync. James, with his intimate knowledge of the company's soul, and Frank, with his mastery of its legal framework. They would not stage a quiet coup. They would orchestrate a public reckoning. "We'll use the bylaws," Frank said, the excitement growing in his voice. Article 3, Section 4. Any shareholder holding more than 50% of the company's stock has the right to call an emergency meeting of the board of directors with just 48 hours' notice. Thorne and David will panic, James mused. They'll spend the next 2 days trying to figure out who the mystery shareholder is. "Let 'em," Frank said with a grim chuckle. "Let them sweat. We'll send the official notice first thing in the morning. The meeting will be on Wednesday at 10 a.m. sharp." "And what will be the agenda?" James asked, though he already knew the answer. "The agenda," Frank replied, savoring the words, "will be a full review of the company's strategic direction and a vote of confidence in its current leadership." After he hung up, James walked to his window and looked out at the sleeping city. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the early days in the garage with Margaret. The grief was still there, a permanent resident in the house of his heart, but it was no longer the only occupant. It now had a roommate, cold, righteous, and beautiful anger. He was no longer a silent shareholder. He was a man preparing for war. The 2 days leading up to the board meeting were a master class in controlled chaos, orchestrated perfectly by James and Frank. While James remained secluded in his apartment, meticulously preparing his case, Frank set the plan in motion, dropping a bomb into the serene, complacent world of Innovate Corp's executive suite. The official notice arrived via a bonded courier at 8 a.m. on Monday, addressed directly to Marcus Thorne. The language was cold, legal, and utterly terrifying. It announced an emergency meeting of the board of directors, called by the holder of a majority stake in the company, to be held in 48 hours. The agenda was stark. A review of corporate performance, strategic direction, and the leadership thereof. The news ripped through the executive floor like a shock wave. Marcus Thorne, a man whose composure was legendary, was seen pacing his office, his face pale. David, summoned immediately, read the notice with a dawning sense of horror. "A majority shareholder?" he said, his voice incredulous. "That's impossible. We know all the major stakeholders. No one holds more than 5%. "Apparently, we were wrong," Thorne snapped, his usual calm shattered. "Someone has been buying up stock quietly, or one of the institutional investors has consolidated its position. This is a hostile move, David, a corporate raid." Panic set in. They spent the next 48 hours in a frantic, desperate scramble to identify the mysterious aggressor. They made hushed, urgent calls to their contacts on Wall Street, to investment bankers, to hedge fund managers. They pored over shareholder lists, trying to find patterns, to connect the dots between the dozens of anonymous holding companies and trusts that owned Innovate Corp stock. But Frank had done his work too well. The ownership was a fortress of legal firewalls, a maze with no center. While they scrambled, James prepared. This was not a battle of emotion. It was a battle of data. He didn't just rely on his memory of the company's golden age. He immersed himself in the cold, hard facts of its present decline. With Frank feeding him every document he requested, he built his case brick by brick. He created charts showing the plummeting R&D investment versus the soaring executive compensation. He compiled a list of the top-tier engineers who had resigned in the past 2 years, complete with their scathing exit interview comments. He analyzed the financials of the projects David had championed, revealing them to be short-term cash grabs that had sacrificed long-term market position. He worked with a cold, detached fury, the accountant in him reawakened and razor-sharp. He was not just preparing a speech, he was preparing an indictment. On the morning of the meeting, James rose before dawn. He did not put on one of his new, expensive suits. He chose an old one, the one he had worn the day Innovate Corp went public. It was a simple, dark gray suit, well worn but immaculate. It was the suit of a builder, not a banker. He wanted to remind them who he was. He arrived at the Innovate Corp headquarters at 9:30 a.m. The building was a gleaming tower of glass and steel, a far cry from the garage where it had all begun. As he walked through the lobby, a space he had designed himself to be open and full of light, he was invisible. The young, ambitious employees rushing past with their lattes and their lanyards saw only a stooped old man who must have gotten lost on his way to the Social Security office. The security guard at the front desk almost didn't let him pass until he showed his old, original employee ID card, which he had kept all these years. The guard, a young man with a bored expression, scanned it, shrugged, and waved him through. He took the elevator to the 40th floor, the executive floor. The doors opened onto a hushed world of expensive art and hushed, important-sounding conversations. He walked down the long corridor, his old leather-soled shoes making almost no sound on the plush carpet. He passed the office that had once been his, now occupied by Marcus Thorne. He saw his son's office, its glass walls displaying a life of curated success. He reached the boardroom door just as Frank was arriving. His old friend gave him a single, firm nod. "Ready, James?" "I've been ready for 15 years, Frank." They entered the room together. The entire board was assembled around the massive mahogany table, their faces a mixture of anxiety and suspicion. Marcus Thorne sat at the head, his knuckles white as he gripped a pen. David sat at his right hand, his face pale and drawn. They were expecting a corporate raider, a slick Wall Street predator. They looked up as James entered, their expressions shifting from anxiety to utter slack-jawed confusion. David's face was a comical picture of disbelief. He looked at his father, then at Frank, then back at his father, his mind clearly unable to process the scene. "Dad?" David stammered. "What are you doing here? This is a closed meeting." James didn't answer. He walked slowly to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table, the one reserved for the chairman, a position that had been vacant since he left. He sat down, placing his old leather briefcase on the table with a soft thud. Frank remained standing. He cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "Gentlemen," Frank began, his voice calm and authoritative, "thank you for assembling on such short notice. As you know, this meeting was called by the majority shareholder of Innovate Corp. There has been much speculation as to the identity of this individual." He paused, letting the tension build. Thorne and David stared at him, their eyes wide with a dawning, terrible understanding. "Allow me to end the suspense," Frank continued, a faint, triumphant smile playing on his lips. "Gentlemen of the board, allow me to introduce you to the beneficial owner of 51% of this company's stock, held in trust by the Kestrel Investment Group." He gestured toward the end of the table. "Please welcome back the founder, the chief architect, and the heart of this company, Mr. James." The shock in the room was a physical force. Jaws dropped. A few of the older board members who remembered James from the early days gasped. But all eyes were on David. His face had gone from pale to ashen. The blood had drained from it, leaving a sickly gray pallor. He stared at his father, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air. The quiet, manageable old man he had just sentenced to a life of gentle yoga and watercolor classes was sitting at the head of the table, holding the fate of the entire company and his own future in his hands. The gambit was complete. The game had begun. For a long moment, the only sound in the boardroom was the faint, electronic hum of the climate control system. The men around the table, titans of industry and finance, were frozen, their minds struggling to reconcile the image of the quiet, forgotten founder with the reality of the immense power he now wielded. David looked as if he had been struck by lightning, his face a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. James let the silence stretch, a deliberate, tactical pause. He wanted them to feel the shift in the earth beneath their feet. He had their complete, undivided attention for the first time in 15 years. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud or angry. It was quiet, measured, and carried the immense weight of his authority. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said, his gaze sweeping across the table, lingering for a fraction of a second longer on his son. "I apologize for the abrupt nature of this meeting, but I have been a silent observer for too long, and what I have observed concerns me deeply." He opened his old leather briefcase and took out a single, slim folder. He didn't need slides or a flashy presentation. He had the facts, and the facts were all the firepower he needed. "When I founded this company," he began, his voice resonating with a passion they had never heard from him, "it was built on a simple principle. Innovation is not a department. It is our soul. We took risks. We funded projects that had no guarantee of short-term profit. We hired brilliant, difficult people and gave them the freedom to fail, because we knew that true breakthroughs are born from 1,000 noble failures. We were not just building products. We were building the future." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I look at this company today, and I no longer see that soul. I see a well-oiled machine, efficient and profitable in the short term, yes. But it is a machine that has forgotten what it was built to create. It is a machine that is consuming itself." He opened the folder. "Let's talk specifics." What followed was not a tirade. It was a clinical, devastating dissection of the company's recent history. He spoke without notes, his memory for figures and dates flawless. He laid out the numbers with the cold precision of an auditor. He showed them the charts he had prepared. R&D spending as a percentage of revenue down 40% in 5 years. Executive bonuses up 60% in the same period. Employee turnover in the engineering division at an all-time high. "You have traded our future for this quarter's stock price," he said, his voice still calm, but now edged with steel. "You have silenced the dreamers and promoted the accountants. You have turned a cathedral of innovation into a marketplace." Then he turned his attention to David. He did not raise his voice. He did not use his son's first name. He addressed him as he would any other executive in the room. "Mr. David," he said, and the formal address made his son flinch. "Let's review the Phoenix Project, which you personally championed last year." He proceeded to dismantle the project piece by piece. He revealed that the projected profits were based on flawed market analysis. He pointed out that in order to meet the aggressive launch date, the quality assurance team had been forced to sign off on a product with known hardware vulnerabilities. He even quoted from an internal email, which Frank had procured, where David had explicitly told his team to ignore the engineers' whining and focus on the optics for the shareholders' meeting. This project, James concluded, looking directly at his son, was not an act of innovation. It was an act of vanity. It generated a temporary spike in our stock price, but it has done irreparable damage to our brand's reputation for quality. It was, in short, a betrayal of everything this company once stood for. David sat frozen, his face ashen. He had no defense. The facts were irrefutable. He was being publicly, methodically, and quietly destroyed by the father he had dismissed as irrelevant. James then turned his gaze to Marcus Thorne. "Marcus," he said, the use of his first name now a sign of condemnation, not familiarity. "I chose you to succeed me because you were brilliant. You were a risk-taker. What happened to that man?" Thorne, for the first time in his professional life, was speechless. "I am exercising my right as the majority shareholder," James announced to the room. "I'm calling for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current chief executive officer, Mr. Marcus Thorne." It was a formality. Frank, acting as his legal proxy, cast the vote. "The motion carries," Frank said into the stunned silence. "Mr. Thorne, you are relieved of your duties, effective immediately." Thorne sagged in his chair as if his strings had been cut. His reign was over, but James was not finished. He had one final, unexpected move to make. "The position of CEO will, of course, need to be filled," he said, "and I have no intention of taking the role myself. My time for that has passed." He looked around the table, his gaze finally resting on a junior board member, a woman in her late 30s who had been silent throughout the entire meeting. "The future of this company," James declared, "lies not in its past, but in its potential. Therefore, I'm appointing an interim CEO, pending full board approval, which I'm confident will be forthcoming." He paused, letting the suspense build. "Her name is Anya Sharma. She is currently a lead project manager in the R&D division. She is brilliant, she is fearless, and according to a memo I have here, signed by Mr. David, she was scheduled to be laid off next month for being insufficiently focused on commercial viability." A ripple of shock went through the room. Appointing a mid-level engineer to run the company was unheard of. It was a radical, audacious move. "As for you, Mr. David," James said, turning his attention back to his son for the last time, "I'm not firing you. That would be too simple. I have a new role in mind for you, a position that I believe will make excellent use of your particular talents." David looked up, a flicker of desperate hope in his eyes. Perhaps this was a reprieve. Perhaps his father was offering an olive branch. James's next words extinguished that hope completely. The air in the boardroom was thick with the wreckage of shattered careers and dismantled egos. David stared at his father, his mind a maelstrom of confusion, humiliation, and a desperate, flickering hope. A new role. What could it be? A lateral move? A demotion to a smaller department? Anything was better than the public execution he had just witnessed. James let the silence hang for a moment longer, ensuring his son felt the full weight of his powerlessness. Then he spoke, his voice as calm and dispassionate as a judge reading a verdict. "Effective immediately, Mr. David," he announced to the room, "you are being reassigned. Your new title will be Chief Archival Officer." A few board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Chief Archival Officer? There was no such position at Innovate Corp. It sounded like a joke, a cruel corporate euphemism for exile. "Your office," James continued, ignoring the confused murmurs, "will be in the sub-basement, in the room currently designated as long-term storage. Your sole responsibility will be to sort, catalog, and digitize every document this company has produced since its inception. Every schematic, every patent application, every piece of correspondence, every lab notebook." He paused, his eyes locking with his son's. "It seems you have forgotten the history of this company, David. You have forgotten what we built and why we built it. So, I'm giving you the opportunity to relearn it from the very beginning. To understand where you're going, you must first understand where you came from." It was a masterstroke of corporate cruelty, a punishment so exquisitely tailored it was almost poetic. He wasn't firing his son. He was burying him in the foundations of the legacy he had tried to erase. He was sentencing him to a solitary monastic existence in a dusty, forgotten room, forced to confront the evidence of his father's genius and his own inadequacy, page by painstaking page. David's face, which had been ashen, now flushed with a deep, mottled red. "You can't be serious," he stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The archives? That's a job for an intern." "Then you shall be the most overqualified intern in the history of this company," James replied without a flicker of emotion. "Consider it a sabbatical, a chance for reflection." "I won't do it," David said, a flash of his old arrogance returning. "I'll resign." "You are, of course, free to do so," James said with a serene, almost gentle smile. "But I would advise against it. Resigning under these circumstances would look rather poor on your resume. And I assure you, the severance package for the Chief Archival Officer is modest. However, if you complete this task to my satisfaction, we can then discuss your future with the company. The choice is yours." The threat was unspoken, but crystal clear. If David quit, he would be blacklisted, his reputation in the industry destroyed. He was trapped. James had not just taken his power, he had taken his options. The days that followed were a descent into a private hell for David. His spacious corner office with its panoramic city views was replaced by a windowless concrete room in the sub-basement. The air was cool and smelled of old paper, dust, and decay. His personal assistant was replaced by a rolling library ladder. His team of eager subordinates was replaced by thousands of cardboard boxes, stacked from floor to ceiling, each one a tombstone marking a past he had never valued. The first day, he did nothing. He sat at the metal desk they had provided, surrounded by the silent, accusing boxes, and seethed. He was consumed by a white-hot rage at his father, at Frank, at the world. He composed a dozen scathing resignation letters in his head, each one more eloquent and self-righteous than the last. but he never wrote them down. He knew he was beaten. On the second day, driven by a mixture of boredom and a sliver of grudging obedience, he opened the first box. It was labeled 1985 Garage Prototypes. Inside, he found not just dusty papers, but a world. There were hand-drawn schematics on stained napkins, the ink faded, but the ideas still vibrant. There were notebooks filled with his father's spidery, intense handwriting, pages of complex equations interspersed with frustrated scribbles and sudden, brilliant insights. He found a photograph he had never seen before. His father and mother in the old garage, both of them grinning with exhaustion and triumph, holding up a crude, tangled mess of wires that must have been the first Innovate prototype. His mother's face was smudged with grease, and she was looking at his father with a look of such profound love and belief that it made David's throat tighten. He began to work, at first mechanically, then with a growing, grudging curiosity. He sorted through old patent filings, marketing plans for products that never launched, letters from early investors. He was not just cataloging documents, he was excavating his own history. He found a box labeled Personal. Inside, tucked between old financial statements, was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were from his mother to his father, written during a time when James was traveling constantly, trying to secure funding. They were filled with words of encouragement, of unwavering faith. Don't listen to the doubters, Jamie. They see a risk, I see a revolution. Come home safe. The world can wait, but I can't. Beneath the letters, he found something else. A small, handmade card. On the front, a childish crayon drawing of a rocket ship. Inside, in wobbly, 5-year-old printing, it read, "To Daddy, the best inventor in the world. Love, David." He stared at the card, at the ghost of the little boy he had once been. A boy who had seen his father not as an embarrassment or an obstacle, but as a hero. He had kept it. Through all the years, through all the success and the silence, his father had kept this small, clumsy token of his son's love. He sat there in the dusty, silent tomb of his father's past, and for the first time since he was a small boy, David cried. They were not tears of anger or self-pity. They were tears of a profound, soul-shattering recognition. He had not just misjudged his father, he had failed to see him at all, and in doing so, he had lost himself. The lesson had begun. The archive ceased to be a prison and became a sanctuary. The dust of the past, which had initially felt like a suffocating shroud, now seemed to hold the very DNA of the company, of his family, of the man his father truly was. David stopped seeing the work as a punishment. It became a pilgrimage. He lost track of time, often working late into the night, the only light in the sub-basement coming from his small desk lamp, illuminating the ghosts of forgotten ideas and whispered dreams. He learned about the sacrifices. He found the records of his father mortgaging their family home, twice, to make payroll during the early, lean years. He discovered memos detailing James's refusal to take a salary for the first 3 years, ensuring every penny went back into research. He read the letters from his mother, Margaret, where she spoke of selling her own family jewelry to pay for a crucial piece of equipment. This wasn't the story of a man who had gotten lucky. It was the story of two people who had wagered their entire existence on a single, brilliant idea. He also learned about the philosophy that had been lost. He unearthed a manifesto James had written in 1988 for new employees, titled The Principles of Innovation. It spoke of valuing curiosity over certainty, of celebrating elegant failures, of building products that were not just profitable, but meaningful. It was a document filled with a passion and a purity of purpose that felt alien to the slick corporate world David had so proudly inhabited. He realized with a sickening clarity that he and Marcus Thorne had not just changed the company's direction. They had actively betrayed its founding principles. The change in him was gradual but profound. He started dressing differently, abandoning his sharp, expensive suits for simple shirts and trousers. The arrogant, confident stride of the senior vice president was replaced by the quieter, more thoughtful gait of a man humbled by knowledge. The employees who occasionally saw him in the hallways barely recognized him. One evening, he came home late, his hands smudged with ink from old documents. Claire was waiting for him in their pristine, minimalist living room. She had been distant and resentful since the boardroom coup, treating him with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Still playing with dusty papers in the basement?" she asked, her voice sharp with sarcasm. For the first time, he didn't react with anger or defensiveness. He looked at her, at their perfectly decorated, emotionally sterile home, and saw it for what it was, a gilded cage, just like the one he had tried to put his father in. "I'm learning about my father, Claire," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm learning about the man who built the world that paid for this house, for your clothes, for our entire life." "Oh, please," she scoffed. "He's a vindictive old man who humiliated you." "No," David said, shaking his head slowly. "He's a genius who I was too arrogant and too blind to see. He didn't humiliate me. He held up a mirror, and I finally saw what I had become." It was the first honest conversation they had had in years. He told her about the letters, about the sacrifices, about the manifesto. He spoke not with anger, but with a deep, aching regret. He expected her to mock him, to call him weak. Instead, for the first time, she was silent, listening. The story he told was not one she'd ever heard, and it began to chip away at the foundation of the life they had built together, a life based on the false premise that they were self-made. A week later, David knew what he had to do. He couldn't fix the past, but he had to confront it. He left the office in the middle of the day and drove not to his own home, but to his father's small, quiet apartment. He stood outside the door for a full 5 minutes, his heart pounding. What would he say? How could he possibly begin? He finally knocked, his knuckles rapping softly on the wood. James opened the door. He wasn't surprised to see his son. He simply looked at him with those calm, observant eyes and waited. "Dad," David began, his voice hoarse, Can I come in?" James stepped aside, allowing him entry. The apartment was simple, clean, and filled with a sense of peace that felt a world away from the turmoil in David's own life. They sat in silence for a moment, David in the armchair, James on the simple sofa. David looked around the room, at the old books, the photos of his mother, the life his father had chosen. "I've been reading the archives," David said finally, his gaze fixed on the floor. "All of them." James just nodded, waiting. "I read about the mortgage. I read about Mom's jewelry. I read your principles of innovation." He looked up, his eyes filled with a raw, painful emotion James hadn't seen since he was a boy. "I didn't know," he whispered. "In all these years, I never knew." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I came here to apologize, not not for the retirement home. That was just a symptom. It was cruel and stupid, but it was just the final act of a much longer betrayal. He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. I'm sorry for not seeing you. I'm sorry for being ashamed of your simplicity, without ever understanding the strength and the genius it concealed. I'm sorry for thinking that my success was my own, when I was standing on a mountain that you built. I'm sorry for not being a better son. James listened to the confession without a word, his expression unreadable. The silence that followed was long and heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken years. David waited, his shoulders slumped, prepared for a lecture, for anger, for dismissal. But when James finally spoke, his voice was quiet, devoid of triumph. Words are easy, David, he said, his gaze steady and clear. They are the first step, but they are not the journey. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. You have spent your life chasing a version of success that I never taught you. You valued profit over people, perception over principle. You cannot undo that with a single apology. I know, David said, his voice cracking, but I want to change. I need to change. Then don't tell me about it, James said, turning back to face him. Show me. The archives are full of abandoned projects, brilliant ideas that were deemed not profitable enough. Find one, the one that speaks to the boy who used to build rocket ships in the garage. Build something that matters again. Prove that you have finally understood the difference between value and price. It was not the absolution David had hoped for, but it was something more valuable. It was a challenge, a path forward, a chance, however small, to earn back not his inheritance, but his father's respect. He stood up, his resolve hardening. I will, he said. It was not a promise made to his father. It was a vow made to himself. He walked out of the apartment that day not as a disgraced executive, but as a man with a new and much more difficult mission. David returned to the sub-basement not as an exile, but as a prospector searching for gold. He no longer saw the boxes as a punishment. He saw them as a library of lost opportunities. He spent weeks sifting through old research, his trained executive mind now guided by a newfound sense of purpose. He ignored the projects that promised quick returns and sought out the ones that were ambitious, difficult, and revolutionary. He found it in a box labeled Project Nightingale, 1995, shelved. It was one of his father's most audacious ideas, a neural interface technology designed to help people with degenerative nerve diseases communicate. It was complex, decades ahead of its time, and had been abandoned by the board after Margaret's death, deemed too costly and with no clear path to commercialization. To the old David, it would have been a financial non-starter. To the new David, it was a masterpiece. It was a project built not just to make money, but to make a difference. He began working on it in secret, using his evenings and weekends. He brought a small cot into the archive room, often sleeping there, surrounded by the ghosts of his father's genius. He used his business acumen not to cut costs, but to find new, more efficient pathways for development. He reached out to some of the old engineers who had resigned, not with promises of stock options, but with the schematics for Project Nightingale. He spoke their language now, the language of innovation and purpose. Two of them, intrigued by the challenge and the change in David's demeanor, agreed to consult for him for free. After 2 months of relentless work, he had a revised proposal, a working prototype plan, and a clear, albeit challenging, roadmap. He didn't go to his father. He knew that would be the easy way. Instead, he scheduled a meeting with Anya Sharma, the new interim CEO. Anya was tough, brilliant, and deeply skeptical of him. She had been one of the engineers whose projects he had personally cut in the past. She listened to his presentation with her arms crossed, her expression impassive. He didn't use corporate jargon or flashy graphics. He laid out the science, the potential, and the philosophy behind the project. He spoke with a passion and a humility she had never seen in him. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. "This is your father's work," she said finally. "Yes," David admitted, "but I believe I know how to make it a reality now." "Why should I trust you?" she asked, her gaze direct. "You're the man who tried to kill the soul of this company." "Because," David said, meeting her eyes without flinching, "that man is gone. I spent 2 months in the basement burying him." Anya saw the truth in his eyes. She saw the exhaustion, the sincerity, and the flicker of his father's genius that had finally been ignited. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You get a skeleton crew and a probationary budget," she said. "Don't make me regret this." David's new office was a small disused lab in the corner of the R&D building. It was a step up from the basement, but a world away from the luxury of the executive floor. He didn't care. He had a team, a purpose, and a second chance. He worked with an intensity he hadn't felt since he was a young man trying to prove himself. But this time, he wasn't trying to prove his worth to the world. He was trying to prove it to himself. Several months passed. The project was difficult, with constant setbacks, but David and his small team persevered. He learned to lead not by command, but by collaboration. He learned to listen to his engineers, to value their insights, to celebrate their small victories. One evening, as he was working late in the lab, the door opened. It was James. He had been receiving quiet updates from Anya, but this was the first time he had come to see the project for himself. He didn't say a word. He walked around the lab, looking at the whiteboards filled with equations, at the crude but functioning prototype on the workbench, at the focused, passionate faces of the young engineers. He stopped in front of a schematic David had been working on. He studied it for a long moment, then pointed to a single connection. "If you reverse the polarity on this feedback loop," he said softly, "you'll eliminate the signal degradation by at least 12%. David stared at the schematic, then back at his father. It was a simple, elegant solution he had been struggling with for weeks. It was the effortless insight of a master. "Thanks, Dad," David said, his voice thick with emotion. James didn't reply. He simply placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a brief, firm pressure that conveyed more than words ever could. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. It was respect. The story of David's fall and rise became a quiet legend within Innovate Corp. He never returned to the executive floor. He found his true calling in the lab, becoming the head of the newly re-established Blue Sky division, dedicated to the kind of long-term, high-risk projects his father had always championed. He was no longer a manager of profits. He was a cultivator of ideas. James remained the majority shareholder, the silent, watchful guardian of the company's soul. He let Anya Sharma and the new generation lead, intervening only when he felt the company was straying from its core principles. He never moved from his small apartment. It was all he needed. One afternoon, about a year after his 70th birthday, he was sitting in his armchair, reading. He noticed the glossy green brochure for Silver Willows still sitting on his bookshelf, a relic of a battle fought and won. He picked it up, looked at the smiling, serene faces on the cover, and felt a sense of profound peace. He had found his rest, his golden years, but he had found them on his own terms. He walked to the kitchen, dropped the brochure into the recycling bin, and went back to his book. The grandfather clock in his son's old house might have been sold, but in the quiet of his own life, James had finally learned to measure his own time. His legacy was not in the stock price or the corporate tower that bore his company's name. It was in the quiet hum of a laboratory where his son was, at long last, building something that mattered.